The first time I saw those shoes, they didn't look like much. Just two faded scraps of leather balanced on granite, their color bleached by 13 years of sun. But standing there on Half Dome with the wind curling around the cables and the valley yawning 5,000 feet below, I felt the same chill I'd felt the day we lost him. Marcus Chen. His name was tucked inside one of those shoes folded in blue ink, waiting like it had been left for someone who once promised to keep looking. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you believe every buried truth deserves daylight. I'd been out of the service for almost a decade when that call came, in the kind of call that drops you straight back into another life. Back in 2010, Yosemite was my whole world. I lived in a ranger cabin on the south side of the valley, an old structure with thin walls and the faint smell of pine resin baked into the wood. Mornings started early coffee before dawn, then radio check-ins as the cliffs turned from gray to gold. On a clear day, you could hear the falls before you saw them, a steady rush like distant applause. Summers followed a rhythm. Hikers at sunrise, climbers heading for the walls by mid-morning campfires glowing after dark. Tourists came for the views, but for those of us who worked there, it was more like a heartbeat, predictable, steady, until something went wrong. That June began the same as 100 others. Snowmelt swelled the Merced River, turning it white and fast. Bears wandered too close to campgrounds, and we'd chase them off with paintball rounds and loud voices. The air smelled of cedar smoke and sunscreen. Most evenings I'd sit outside the ranger station with Linda Takahashi, who ran the SAR team back then. She had this habit of cleaning her radio antenna with a cloth whenever she was thinking. I'd tease her about it. She'd laugh, roll her eyes, then remind me that the job was all about readiness. The calm is the trap, she used to say. It tricks you before it breaks. I didn't know that phrase would come back to me later. Marcus showed up on one of those warm Friday mornings. I remember his car's silver Honda Accord dusted with road grit from the drive up from the bay. He was quiet, polite, the sort of climber who kept his rope coiled perfectly and thanked you twice when you pointed out the restrooms. We got a lot of weekend climbers that time of year, but Marcus stood out because he seemed deliberate. He wasn't chasing glory or adrenaline. He was chasing precision. David Chen, his friend, waited by the car while Marcus laid out his gear on the tailgate cam's nuts, webbing a bright orange pair of climbing shoes that looked brand new. They both laughed about something I couldn't hear, probably the kind of nervous humor climbers use before a big route. Then David drove off toward Tahoe, and Marcus walked toward the base of El Capitan with his pack slung low across his shoulder. It was 8:30 that morning. The sun hadn't yet burned off the dew on the meadow. A couple of us waved as he passed. Nothing about that moment felt remarkable. I didn't know then that it was the last time anyone would see him alive. In small towns, because even a place as vast as Yosemite can feel like one, you start to recognize patterns. The same campers return every year. The same photographers stand in the same pullouts for sunset shots. People notice when something's out of place. For me, that weekend felt unusually still. Saturday passed without a single rescue call, which was rare for early June. By Sunday, the stillness had turned into a kind of quiet tension, like the park was holding its breath. The heat climbed into the mid-80s by afternoon, and the granite walls shimmered. Down in the meadow, I remember watching families spread out picnic blankets, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. From the ranger station, you could see El Capitan catching the evening light, massive, unbending, beautiful. Somewhere on that face, I thought a young man was testing himself against the stone. But the next day came and went. No check-in. No sighting. Still, that wasn't unusual. Climbers often ran behind schedule or stayed an extra night. It was only when Marcus's friend called midweek asking if anyone had seen him that the edges of that calm began to fray. Before all that, before the radio traffic, the search grids, the helicopters, it was just another quiet stretch of summer in a place built from silence and stone. Angela Chen called the station that Thursday. I took the call because Linda was out on a training exercise. The line crackled and her voice sounded young and scared the way family always does when they're trying to stay composed. She said her brother was supposed to text her Sunday night after finishing his climb. He never did. His phone went straight to voicemail. I told her we'd look into it. We always did. That night after I logged off duty, I stood outside my cabin. The valley was deep in shadow except for the faint white ribbon of Yosemite Falls under the moonlight. The air smelled of dust and river water. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote barked. Everything felt normal too, normal. I remember thinking I should have seen something, a campfire flicker where it shouldn't be a glint of metal on the rock. Anything. But there was nothing. Just the hum of insects and the river moving somewhere far below. Marcus's parents came up from Daly City a few days later. They looked out of place amid the tents and trail maps city people swallowed by wilderness. His father shook my hand twice, as if holding on would keep his son tethered somehow. His mother barely spoke, just stared at the cliffs with a look I've seen too many times, the look of someone bargaining with mountains. We started organizing preliminary checks casual at first. Rangers on the East Buttress routes kept an eye out for abandoned gear. A few climbers mentioned seeing someone who might have matched Marcus's description near the meadow that Saturday morning, but no one had spoken to him. By mid-June, the official search hadn't yet begun, but I could feel it coming. The stillness before the storm. That week I drove out to the overlook above the valley at dusk. The granite domes turned pink, then purple as the light faded. I rolled down my window and listened. In the distance, a hawk circled. Somewhere below, the Merced shimmered like liquid glass. The place was so peaceful it hurt to imagine danger there. But something about that peace felt off, like a photograph left too long in the sun, familiar yet drained of life. On June 15th, the phone on my desk rang after dark. The rangers who'd been checking LCAP reported back they'd found his car locked, still sitting where he'd parked it. His wallet and phone were inside. I set the receiver down and looked through the office window. Across the meadow, El Capitan rose into the night, black against the stars. The porch light over the ranger cabin flickered once, then steadied. I left it burning a little longer that night, just in case. The night we found Marcus's car, the air hung heavy and still. You could smell the granite dust and pine sap baked into the ground after another hot day. The parking lot at El Capitan Meadow was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when a place that's usually alive with people suddenly isn't. His silver Honda sat in the far corner under a sugar pine, perfectly parked doors locked. I remember the way the reflection of my flashlight caught on the rear-view mirror. It almost looked like an eye staring back. Inside were his wallet phone and a folded park map, still sitting in the center console. Nothing else seemed wrong, and that's what unsettled me the most. People who panic, people who get lost, they leave traces of that fear. But Marcus's car looked like he'd intended to come back any minute. Linda arrived not long after. She was still in uniform, her radio hissing softly as she walked toward me. We stood there in the dark, neither of us speaking for a while. Then she said, "Let's start early tomorrow, before the sun hits the wall." I nodded. She didn't need to explain. We'd both worked enough cases to know that every hour counts before the mountain decides to take back what it's holding. By dawn, our search team was assembled: 8 rangers, 2 climbers from SAR, and a helicopter unit waiting on standby. The valley floor was painted gold by the rising sun mist curling off the river like smoke. From where we stood, El Capitan was just waking up too, the light sliding down its face in long silver streaks. It looked peaceful, but to anyone who's worked in that park, you know the rock has moods. That morning it felt distant. We started with the basics, the East Buttress approach trail. It winds through a stretch of mixed pine and manzanita before climbing toward the base. We spread out in pairs, radios clipped to our packs. I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots and the sound of insects already humming, the kind of low vibration that fills the space when no one's talking. We found nothing, no boot prints, no discarded gear, no sign that Marcus had ever walked that path. Around mid-morning, the helicopter began its first sweep, slow and deliberate, circling the cliffs and ledges. Through binoculars, the rock face looked alive, tiny dots of color where other climbers moved methodically upward. Linda contacted each team on the wall, asking if anyone had seen a solo climber matching Marcus's description. They hadn't. Most said they'd only noticed regular guided groups that weekend. I scanned ledges I'd known for years, the familiar bivvy spots halfway up places where climbers slept suspended between sky and valley. They were all empty. When the chopper landed for refuel, we sat in the shade near the meadow. Someone handed me a bottle of water that tasted faintly metallic from the heat. Linda sat cross-legged on the grass, her brow furrowed. "He's not on the wall," she said quietly, more to herself than to any of us. I could hear the weight in her voice, the beginning of that doubt that creeps in when logic starts to lose its footing. By evening, we had nothing. We regrouped at the station, mapping out what we'd covered and what we hadn't. The last sighting anyone could confirm was Marcus that Friday morning. A couple of climbers recalled seeing an Asian man near the meadow, but no one had seen him gear up or start climbing. It was as if he'd stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. That night, I drove back to my cabin with the radio still on volume low. The static kept me company. Outside the valley was washed in moonlight, the cliffs pale and ghost-like. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, even though it was near midnight, couldn't shake the sense that we were missing something right in front of us. Yosemite isn't the kind of place that lets you lose a man without a trace. It always leaves a footprint somewhere, you just have to know where to look. The next few days blurred together. More rangers joined in volunteers, too. Helicopters ran grid patterns over El Capitan and the valley floor. We searched drainage areas, old trails, even the talus slopes where debris collects like forgotten history. Nothing. Every night ended with Linda standing over the map table, her hand tracing new routes, her eyes distant. I could tell she wasn't sleeping much. None of us were. By the 5th day, Marcus's family arrived. His parents came first, weary from the drive, holding on to each other like the ground might give way. Angela came later still in her nurse's scrubs, her hair pulled back tight, exhaustion written across her face. I met her outside the command trailer. She shook my hand and asked, "Did he check out a route permit?" I told her he hadn't, which was strange but not unheard of for experienced climbers. She nodded slowly, trying to make sense of it, then said, "He always texted when he was back on the ground." That detail stuck with me, the ritual of checking in broken for the first time. Over the next week, the park filled with volunteers. Climbers from the Bay Area, local hikers, even off-duty rangers who'd worked other parks came to help. Angela organized everything from a folding table near the visitor center, coordinating names and areas of coverage. I'd see her sitting there late into the evening, flipping through maps with a flashlight, her lips moving as she whispered her brother's name under her breath. We found nothing. Not a single scrap of evidence. No rope, no gear, no clothing. The kind of emptiness that feels intentional, like the park itself was erasing him. By the end of June, the official search shifted to recovery status. That's never an easy moment. You can feel the air change in the room when the word recovery replaces rescue. Linda made the call with her usual quiet dignity, but I saw her hands tremble when she put the phone down. Angela stayed behind after the briefing, her eyes rimmed red. She didn't argue, she just asked if she could keep looking on her own. She did. For weeks afterward, I'd see flyers taped to trees and trail signs, "Missing Climber, Marcus Chen." The picture was the same one from the trailhead, Marcus smiling with his pack on orange shoes just visible at his feet. That image haunted me more than any of it, the calm in his face, the certainty that he knew what he was doing. Summer faded. The search quieted. Families came and went. The park moved on. But every time I walked through the meadow, I found myself glancing up at the wall, scanning those ledges again. I never stopped expecting to see a flash of color, some sign that he'd left behind a trace after all. Years passed. The case turned cold, then colder. His file stayed on a shelf with others like it labeled dated but never closed. Sometimes we'd mention it at reunions or training sessions, usually late in the night when old cases resurfaced like ghosts. Whatever happened to that climber, someone would ask, and no one would have an answer. In 2015, after I retired, I visited Angela once more. She'd kept the Facebook page running, posting on his birthday, on anniversaries, small notes like prayers cast into the digital void. She told me her parents had closed their restaurant. She said the hardest part wasn't losing hope, it was living with the possibility that he might have suffered alone out there. I didn't know what to say to that. Some silences don't have words big enough to fill them. Then, 13 years after that summer, I got another call. It was August 2023, a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my backyard drinking coffee when my old work phone buzzed, the number still linked to the park office. I almost didn't answer. On the other end was Linda, her voice low and deliberate. "Dan," she said, "we found something. You need to come in." By the time I arrived, the sun was already high, the mountains framed in haze from distant wildfires. Linda led me into her office, where a pair of dusty orange climbing shoes sat sealed inside a clear evidence bag. They were cracked, sun-faded to a pale coral, but I recognized them instantly. Those were his. Next to the shoes was a plastic bag holding a note written in block letters. Marcus Chen, June 12, 2010, and a string of coordinates that made no sense. The location they pointed to wasn't anywhere near El Capitan. It was miles across the valley near Mount Watkins, a place few people ever climb. Linda looked at me and said quietly, "They were found on the summit of Half Dome last week." I felt the room tilt a little. Half Dome is more than 4 miles from El Capitan, separated by deep forest and cliffs. Marcus wasn't an elite climber. He wouldn't have made that traverse not alone, not unrecorded. And yet, there were his shoes carefully placed side by side like an offering to the wind. I drove home that evening with the image of those shoes burned into my mind. The valley was hazy, the sun an orange coin sinking behind the ridgeline. Everything looked the same as it had 13 years ago, yet different, like a familiar dream that refuses to fade. I didn't know what those coordinates would lead to, not yet. But I knew this, whatever we'd missed back then, the mountain was giving us one more chance to listen. And this time we couldn't afford to ignore what it was trying to tell us. When I got home that evening, the sky over the Sierra was the color of ash. The fire haze made everything feel suspended, like the whole valley was holding its breath again, same way it did 13 years before when Marcus first disappeared. I sat on the porch with a beer I didn't really want and stared at the mountains, trying to imagine the route from El Capitan to Half Dome. It didn't make sense. I'd walked every mile of that terrain in my career, and nothing about it added up. The next morning, I drove back to the ranger office. Linda was there, coffee in hand, eyes red from a night without sleep. She didn't bother with small talk. "We ran the coordinates," she said. "They point to a ledge on Mount Watkins. I knew the place, tough climb, steep approach, barely visited except by technical climbers." She set the map on the desk and tapped the mark. "We're sending a team up." Then she looked at me. "You in?" I didn't even have to answer. We hiked out before dawn on September 5th. 4 of us in total. Linda, a young ranger named Porter, another climber named Alvarez, and me. The air was cool enough to bite through our jackets. The forest was thick with pine needles and quiet except for the rhythm of our boots on the trail. It took most of the day just to reach the base of Watkins. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, we were setting up camp in the shadow of the wall, a 2,000-foot granite face that seemed to swallow what little light was left. The silence out there is different. It presses on you like sound itself has been thinned out. We lit a small stove, shared freeze-dried meals, and barely spoke. Everyone was running the same thought through their heads. What if this really was his last stop? The climb started at first light. Alvarez led smooth and efficient, his rope slicing through the morning air. I followed slower than I used to be, but steady. The granite was cold under my palms, rough in a way that tells you how old it really is. By noon, we reached the elevation that matched the coordinates. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, just a wide ledge hidden behind a windbreak of stone. But the moment I pulled myself over the lip, I knew we were in the right place. There was a torn blue tarp half buried in dirt scraps of webbing clinging to the rock and the rusted outline of what once might have been a small campsite. Linda knelt beside an empty metal bottle and turned it over in her hands. The logo had faded, but I could still make out the year 2010. There were food packets, too, the kind you'd find in a climber's pack, same vintage. Someone had lived here long enough to eat to wait to run out of both. Then Alvarez called out from a shallow alcove at the back of the ledge. "You'll want to see this." Inside was a small journal wrapped in plastic. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed at the edges. I recognized the handwriting before anyone said the name. Marcus Chen. We sat in the dust, the wind cutting through the ledge, and Linda carefully opened the first page. His entries began on June 12th, the day he vanished. The early notes were measured like a man cataloging a trip. Then the tone shifted. Words like "felt wrong" and "different path" began to appear. He wrote about something he'd seen on the approach, something that changed his plan entirely. There was mention of lights faint moving through trees where no trail should be. At first it read like confusion or maybe fatigue, but Marcus was deliberate even in fear. He wrote that he intended to stay and watch to document what he found. The handwriting grew frantic by the middle of the journal letters, cramped ink pressed deep. The final pages were shorter scattered. "Too far to go," one said. "Water almost gone." The last entry was dated June 28th. "Sorry, Angela." None of us spoke for a long time. The valley below was quiet except for wind scraping across stone. I felt that same sinking in my chest I'd felt the night we first lost him. We photographed every item, logged every piece of debris, then began combing the ledge for remains. Nothing. No bones, no scraps of clothing, not even a boot print. Porter rappelled off the side to check the slope below. Nothing there either. It was like he'd stood on that ledge, written his final note, and stepped into thin air. We descended slowly, loaded down with evidence bags and the weight of questions we didn't have words for. That night back at the base, I lay awake listening to the wind move through the pines. It sounded almost like whispering, just the forest breathing, but after reading those pages, my mind twisted it into something else. The next morning, we hiked out. I carried the journal in my pack. It felt wrong to hand it off to anyone else. At the lab in the park's headquarters, forensic techs took over. They confirmed the handwriting was Marcus's, the ink consistent with age. Every detail matched. But the real puzzle was the coordinates, the ones found in his shoe on Half Dome. When plotted, they didn't lead exactly to the ledge we'd found. They pointed about 100 yards east to another section of wall none of us had explored. Linda frowned at the map. "Maybe a second site," she said. Or maybe he made it there before the end. She was already organizing another climb. By December, the snow line had started creeping lower, but one of the younger climbing rangers volunteered to make the ascent. I wasn't fit for that climb anymore, not in the cold, but I watched the live tracker from the command center. Around 2 in the afternoon, his voice came over the radio, thin but clear. "I'm at the spot." He described a narrow shelf tucked under an overhang partially hidden by lichen and moss. No sign of a camp, no gear, but he said there was something carved into the rock. The letters were faint, weathered but still legible. MC 619-10. The same date Marcus had written about finding the access point. That detail hit me harder than I expected. He'd been there. He'd stood on that shelf and marked his name into the mountain like a man leaving proof of existence. But proof of what? Over the next few weeks, the Park Service began planning a full-scale winter search, the kind we only attempt when something truly won't let go. I wasn't on active duty anymore, but Linda asked me to help coordinate logistics. 25 people joined rangers, climbers, volunteers who'd worked cases like this before. We used drones dogs, even ground-penetrating radar combing every ridge and drainage around Mount Watkins. It went on for 5 days, cold, methodical, exhausting. Nothing. Not a single new trace. By the end of the week, we stood in a clearing overlooking the valley. Snow dusted the pines, and the sky had that thin winter light that makes everything look sharper than it should. Linda's voice was hoarse when she finally said, "We've done all we can." She stared out toward the cliffs as she said it, as if waiting for the rock to answer. But it didn't. The journal went into evidence, the shoes beside it. Angela flew in the following month, and I sat with her while Linda explained what we'd found. She listened quietly, holding the edge of the table, her knuckles white. When Linda finished, Angela asked just one question. Did he see something none of us could answer? After she left, I walked down to the meadow one more time. The sun was setting over the valley, turning the cliffs a deep rose color. Somewhere beyond that skyline lay the ledge where Marcus had written his final words. The mountains looked so calm, you'd never know they were keeping secrets. I think about him often, about the way he'd written that he saw lights where no trail existed, how he'd left a map that led us halfway to the truth. I've worked a lot of cases in my time, but this one lingers. Maybe because the evidence is there plain and real. Yet the meaning hides just out of reach, like something seen from the corner of your eye. Even now, when the air is still and the sun drops low over the granite walls, I swear I catch a flicker in the tree line, a movement that doesn't belong. Maybe it's just memory playing tricks. Or maybe it's what Marcus saw that night, something that called him off the path and into the dark, something he thought he could explain if only he climbed a little higher. Whatever it was, the mountain never gave him back. And standing there in the fading light, I realized that maybe it never will. But for some reason, the valley still feels like it's waiting for one more clue, one more sign, one more whisper of a man who thought he'd found an answer no one else could see. After that winter search, the park went still again. The snow came down thick that February, laying a white hush over the valley that made even the waterfalls seem muted. Most years I'd find that kind of quiet peaceful, but not that season. That year it felt like a held breath waiting on something none of us could name. I'd stopped by the station one morning to drop off paperwork when Linda called me into her office. She had that look, jaw-tight, eyes sharper than usual. "We're running one more operation," she said. "Final sweep before the thaw." There was no point in asking why. I already knew. We'd all agreed to close the book, but the truth is, no one really had. By January's end, 25 of us gathered at the trailhead under a sky the color of steel. Rangers, volunteer climbers, even a few familiar faces from the old search days. I recognized the exhaustion in everyone's eyes. Some came because they wanted closure. Others, like me, because we couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus might have seen up there. Whatever it was, he'd believed it enough to keep going until there was nothing left to give. The climb to Mount Watkins was harder this time. Snowpack thick, air-thin temperatures hovering near freezing. You could hear ice breaking off the cliffs in sharp echoes that rolled down the valley like distant thunder. We moved in teams, slow and methodical, checking every ledge, every drainage. I carried one of the thermal scanners, a habit I'd kept from my old days, sweeping the ground for any sign of irregularity. The screen stayed blank. We found the carving again, those faint initials, MC, and the date underneath. 13 years of weather had nearly erased them. I brushed off what lichen I could, ran a gloved hand over the grooves. The stone was colder than I remembered, like it had pulled the heat straight out of my skin. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he hadn't just been leaving a mark for us. Maybe he'd been warning someone else. Drones flew overhead while dogs worked the lower slopes. They moved in patterns, noses to the snowtails, stiff with focus. Once mid-afternoon, one of the dogs caught something, barked twice, then went silent. We hurried over, hearts pounding, but it turned out to be an old deer carcass half buried under ice. Linda didn't say a word, just turned and motioned to keep moving. By the 5th day, we'd covered almost everything within a 2-mile radius of those coordinates. The operation was thorough. We left no crevice unchecked. Still, we found nothing. It's a strange kind of emptiness standing in a place that should hold answers and realizing it never will. You start wondering if the mountain itself made a decision to hide him to keep his secret. When we called the final sweep that evening, the wind was so strong it stripped the warmth right off your breath. The last thing I remember before heading down was the sound of the radio static blending with the wind, 2 kinds of noise that meant the same thing. Nothing found. After the debrief, Linda sat in the back of the truck, quiet. "That's it," she said finally, her voice flat. "No more funding, no more field ops." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. You can't argue with facts. You can't tell a mountain to let go. Angela flew in the next month to attend the formal closure meeting. She looked different now, older, steadier somehow, but her eyes carried that same tired grief I'd seen years ago. We walked together to the evidence room where they'd stored what remained of her brother's belongings, the shoes sealed in plastic, the journal still folded inside its wrap, a few photos of the site. She didn't touch anything, just stood there with her arms crossed. After a long pause, she asked, "You've seen the ledge. Do you think he knew what was coming?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering. "I think he was following something he couldn't explain," I said. And by the time he realized what it was too late to turn back. She nodded, though I don't think it gave her any comfort. A few weeks later, she held a small service here in the valley. Not a funeral exactly, there was no body, but a gathering family and a few rangers who'd searched with us back then. The chapel windows looked out on the granite peaks still streaked with snow. Angela stood at the front and read a letter she'd written to her brother. She thanked him for teaching her to be brave for the phone calls after every climb, for showing her that curiosity wasn't weakness. When she said his name, her voice caught for the first time. "Wherever you are," she whispered, "I hope you found what you were looking for." After the service, people lingered outside, unsure how to leave. I stayed behind talking with Linda as the crowd thinned. She said the case would remain open on record, but inactive. "We'll file it as presumed deceased," she said quietly, though that never feels right saying out loud. I told her I understood. Later that evening, I walked alone out to the meadow. The sun was dropping behind Half Dome, painting the valley in deep orange light. For a moment, it looked like the granite itself was glowing from within. I stopped at the same spot where we'd first seen the helicopters rise 13 years ago. The air smelled of pine and melting snow. And for just a second, I thought about those shoes again, placed so carefully on the summit toes, pointed toward the valley, like a man saying goodbye to the world below. I don't know who brought them there or when. Could have been Marcus himself. Could have been someone who found his things later and wanted to honor him. Or maybe it was something else. Something we'll never name. All I know is that when the 3 climbers discovered them, they weren't abandoned. They were placed deliberate as a ritual. I've spent most of my life around people who think they can read nature, who believe the wilderness tells its secrets if you're patient enough. But I've learned the opposite. The longer you stare, the more the line between reason and belief blurs. I think Marcus crossed that line. Maybe not out of arrogance or despair, maybe out of faith in something only he could see. After sunset, I stayed in the meadow until the first stars came out. The granite walls turned silver under moonlight, and the river whispered through the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker high on the ridgeline, just a pinprick of movement, faint and rhythmic, like a lantern swaying in the dark. I knew it was probably just a reflection from a hiker's headlamp miles away, but it held my gaze until it vanished. When I finally walked back toward the truck, the park was quiet again. Behind me, Half Dome rose like a sleeping giant, its face pale against the night sky. I remember thinking how small we all are out there, just flashes of color and breath against something ancient. We'd done our jobs. We'd searched every corner, read every word he left behind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The story wasn't over. Something about it felt unfinished, like the mountain was keeping one last secret. And maybe that's why, even now, I still find myself driving out there once a year. I'll park by the meadow, sit on the hood, and watch the granite turn gold with the morning light. Sometimes I bring flowers. Sometimes I bring nothing at all. I just sit and listen to the wind through the trees to the water moving unseen below. It's quiet then, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the valley itself is listening back. That's where I was when the radio crackled again, one faint message cutting through the static, a ranger's voice saying they'd found something near the drainage below Watkins. And just like that, the waiting began again. The call came through just after sunrise. I was still sitting in the meadow, coffee cooling beside me, the fog just starting to lift off the river. The voice on the radio was calm but careful, the kind of tone you learn to use when you don't want to say too much over the air. They'd found something below the east drainage of Mount Watkins. Not a body, not yet, but something that might matter. By the time I reached the site, the sun had burned off most of the mist. A small team was already there, clustered near the base of a ravine. The snow was patchy, in places crusted with ice. One of the younger rangers waved me over. At his feet, half buried under a fallen branch, was a small metal carabiner dulled with rust. It looked ordinary at first, until I saw the faint initials etched into one side. MC. The kind of mark a climber makes to tell his gear apart from the rest. We found nothing else that day. No bone, no fabric, no remains. Just that small piece of metal and a section of rope frayed to nothing. But it was enough for the park to close the case enough to say he was gone, that nature had claimed what was left. To most people, that single clue meant closure. To me, it meant something quieter. It meant Marcus had made it further than we thought, that he'd fought longer, that he hadn't given up easily. The official report came out a month later, missing presumed deceased. No sign of foul play, no evidence of anyone else involved. Just a man who walked into the wilderness and never came back. For the record, that's where the story ends. But the truth, the part you live with after the paperwork, is messier than that. Angela returned to the park one last time that spring. She asked me to meet her near the overlook above the valley. The snow was gone by then, and the cliffs were streaked with water from the melt. She was quiet when she spoke, her voice carrying the same steadiness her brother had once had. She said she wanted to see the place for herself, to stand somewhere he might have looked before it all went wrong. So we hiked up to the ridge that faced Mount Watkins. From there you could see the sweep of the granite wall, a sheer face of silver stone glowing in the late afternoon light. She stood at the edge for a long while, hair lifting in the wind, eyes locked on the horizon, the Yah. When she finally turned back, she said, "He must have thought he was close to something. Something real." I didn't have an answer. Some silences aren't meant to be filled. We walked down together before dark, and when we reached the trailhead, she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up." Her voice caught a little when she said it. It helps knowing someone still remembers. I wanted to tell her that remembering is both a gift and a curse, that it keeps a person alive in your mind, but it also keeps them from resting. Instead, I just nodded and said I'd see her again. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and drove off into the dusk. The shoes are still here, stored in a glass case in the evidence room. The orange has faded almost to pink now. Every few years, they rotate the collection for review, and when that happens, I find myself standing there longer than I should, reading his name on the tag like it's the first time. The journal sits beside them, sealed and catalogued. I've read it more than I should have. Some lines I can still recall word for word felt wrong about El Cap. Following different path now. If I'm right, this explains everything. And that last one. Sorry, Angela. I've thought about that sentence more than any other. Sorry for what? For worrying her, for not coming home, or for discovering something he couldn't take back. Every so often, climbers still ask about him. Usually newer ones, people who've heard fragments of the story and want to know what really happened. I tell them the same thing I tell everyone. Marcus Chen was careful. He respected the mountain. He didn't make reckless choices. But sometimes, even the careful ones step a little too far into mystery. The wilderness has a way of humbling the confident and haunting the curious. It doesn't offer explanations, it just takes what it takes. In the years since Yosemite has changed in small ways. New protocols, new check-in systems, GPS tracking for certain routes. We learned from cases like his, but the lessons are always written in loss. Linda retired the same year I did. We still talk now and then, mostly about ordinary things, the weather, her garden, the grandkids. But once in a while, the conversation drifts back to Marcus. That boy was looking for something she'll say softly. We just never knew what. And then we both go quiet because there's nothing else to add. As for me, I stayed in the area. Couldn't bring myself to leave the valley for good. I keep a small cabin not far from the river where the nights are long and the stars come down close enough to touch. Sometimes hikers stop by when they get lost or need directions, and I'll brew a pot of coffee and listen to their stories. They talk about their climbs, their near misses, their plans. Every once in a while, someone mentions the old case, the man who vanished and left his shoes behind. They always say it with a kind of reverence, like it's become part of the park's folklore now. I don't correct them. Let them keep their version. Maybe it's better that way. One evening last summer, I drove up to Glacier Point just before sunset. The light spilled across the granite like molten gold, and the shadows stretched clear across the valley floor. It's the same view Marcus would have known, the same one that draws people here year after year. I sat on the railing with my hands wrapped around a mug, watching the color fade from orange to blue. And for a moment I could almost believe he was out there somewhere quiet, steady, watching the same horizon. The mountains never answer, but they remember. Every gust of wind, every echo bouncing off stone, it's all part of their language. I've come to think that maybe that's what Marcus was chasing. Not a mystery, not a secret, but a kind of understanding that only silence can give. When people ask me what I took from this case, I tell them it taught me patience. It taught me that not every story ends neatly, and not every loss leaves proof behind. Some truths aren't meant to be found, they're meant to be felt. And maybe that's enough. I still see Angela sometimes. She sends a Christmas card every year, always signed the same way for Marcus. Still looking. She took her kids to Yosemite last summer, showed them the meadow, the river, the view from the trailhead. She told me her youngest asked if Uncle Marcus was still up there. I told him yes, she said. Because in a way he is. That's how stories like this survive, not in case files or reports, but in the people who keep saying their names out loud. In the families who refuse to let silence be the last word. If you visit Yosemite, you won't find a plaque or a marker for Marcus Chen. Just a stretch of granite pale against the sky, and maybe if the light hits it right, a faint carving weathered into stone. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen closely, you might hear what we heard back then, the wind moving through the pines, the faint hum of the valley below. And in that sound, something lingers. Not a ghost, not a warning, just the echo of a man who followed curiosity into the wild and became part of it forever. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering even when it hurts is the only way we keep them close.